York, Pennsylvania, 1959. A young weightlifter named Bill March walks into the York Barbell Club gym. But March isn't here for the equipment. He's here because Dr. John Ziegler, the physician to the U.S. weightlifting team, has invited him to his facility in Olney, Maryland, 90 miles away. There, Ziegler hands him something extraordinary, a small pink pill. 1 tablet for 2 weeks. 2 tablets for 2 weeks. 4 tablets for 2 more weeks. Within months, Bill March's lifts climb rapidly. Improvement at a pace that caught the attention of everyone in American weightlifting. Meanwhile, if you trained at a YMCA in Manchester, New Hampshire during that same period, the instructors had all actually trained traditionally. If you were reading Strength and Health magazine in 1961, following the programs exactly, wondering why you couldn't build what the cover models had, you were doing everything right. You were simply excluded by geography and access from a network that was never going to include you. This video is for you. Not to prosecute anyone, not to hand down verdicts on who was natural and who wasn't, but to finally explain the supply chain, the actual distribution network that brought performance-enhancing drugs into silver-era bodybuilding, and why most trainers never even knew it existed. The story starts not in a gym, but in a pharmaceutical laboratory. In 1955, researchers at Ciba Pharmaceuticals in Basel, Switzerland, synthesized a new compound, metandionone. By 1958, Ciba had received FDA approval and began marketing it in the United States under the brand name Dianabol. The drug was initially prescribed to burn victims and the elderly, legitimate medical uses for a substance designed to help the body retain nitrogen and build tissue. Here's what matters for our story. Dianabol was a legal prescription drug. Both testosterone and Dianabol in the 1950s and 1960s were available by prescription. There was no black market because there didn't need to be one. A physician could legally obtain and prescribe these substances through normal pharmaceutical channels. The question was never whether the drug existed. The question was who knew about it, who had access to a sympathetic physician, and how that information traveled. The human gateway was Dr. John Bosley Ziegler. Known to friends as Montana Jack, Ziegler was a 4th-generation doctor whose great-grandfather had served as a physician for the Union Army during the Civil War. He practiced medicine in Olney, Maryland. Ziegler was an enthusiastic weightlifter who befriended Bob Hoffman, the owner of York Barbell Company and publisher of Strength and Health magazine. Hoffman had built York into the unofficial center of American Olympic weightlifting. From the 1930s through the 1970s, the company sponsored over 40 national champions and numerous Olympic gold medalists. The relationship between Ziegler and Hoffman would become the axis around which American performance enhancement rotated. In 1954, Ziegler traveled to Vienna with the American weightlifting team for the World Championships. What happened there changed everything. Over drinks with members of the Soviet team, and Ziegler's capacity for alcohol was legendary. He learned that Russian athletes were using testosterone to enhance their performance. When he returned to America, Ziegler began experimenting. First came testosterone. Ziegler tested weak doses on himself, on Bob Hoffman, and on 3 lifters, John Grimmick, Jim Park, and Yaz Kuzahara. The results were promising, but came with side effects Ziegler found unacceptable. He wanted something more anabolic and less androgenic, something that would build muscle without the broader hormonal disruption. Working with Ciba Pharmaceuticals, Ziegler helped develop what became Dianabol. When the drug reached the market in 1958, he had exactly what he'd been looking for. A dose of 5 to 10 milligrams per day was cautiously suggested as effective. Ziegler administered the pills carefully, performing liver function tests every 4 months on his subjects. He approached distribution with genuine medical caution. The first documented administration to an athlete came in 1959, when Ziegler gave Dianabol to Bill March of the York Barbell Club. By 1960, he had expanded distribution to the entire U.S. Olympic weightlifting team in Rome. The Americans still lost to the Soviets, but something fundamental had shifted in American strength sports. The era of pharmaceutical enhancement had begun. Understanding how the network operated requires understanding what it wasn't. It wasn't a conspiracy. It wasn't a secret society with membership cards. It wasn't even, strictly speaking, limited to the physical premises of York Barbell in Pennsylvania. Ziegler distributed at York, at the Rome Olympics, at his own facility in Olney, Maryland. The network was defined by personal relationships and professional proximity to Ziegler himself, not by geographic coordinates. But geography mattered enormously in practice. If you lived within driving distance of York or Olney, if you trained with the U.S. weightlifting team, if you knew someone who knew Ziegler, you had access to information and substances that simply didn't circulate elsewhere. The network expanded through personal connections, training partners who traveled, gym owners who visited, competition contacts who shared knowledge. One account describes the process in Pasadena during the early 1960s. Occasionally, some guys would come in with a bottle and just pass it around. The circulation was very sporadic. Someone would bring pills to a gym and share them with the people who happened to be there. If you trained at a different gym in a different city with no connection to anyone in that chain, you never heard about it. This is the mechanism of exclusion. Not malice, not secrecy for its own sake. Just the ordinary pattern of how valuable information moves through social networks. Person to person, gym to gym, relationship to relationship. If you weren't in the network, you weren't in the network. What made this exclusion so devastating was what frozen-out trainers did have access to. Information that was technically correct, but strategically incomplete. Strength and Health magazine was the most popular weightlifting magazine in the United States until the late 1960s. Bob Hoffman published training programs, nutrition advice, profiles of champion lifters. Young men across America and Britain read these articles religiously, followed the programs exactly, ate the recommended foods, bought the York barbell products advertised on every page. The programs worked. Progressive resistance training builds muscle. Proper nutrition supports recovery. The fundamental physiological principles were sound. What the magazines omitted, what the fitness publishing industry omitted from the 1950s onward, was the pharmaceutical support that allowed certain athletes to train harder, recover faster, and build muscle at rates the programs alone could never produce. The pattern was industry-wide. Rather than saying athlete X took Dianabol and gained 10 pounds of muscle, they said athlete X took a patented mass gainer and gained 10 pounds. No mention of steroids. The gap between published knowledge and insider knowledge created a warped picture of what was naturally achievable. Covers, captions, and carefully curated training plans that either omitted key variables or failed to mention the pharmaceutical support that made certain results possible. This wasn't unique to Hoffman or Strength and Health. The economics were universal. Supplement companies, including York's own line, profited from the belief that training plus supplements equaled champion physiques. Admitting the existence of steroids would have undermined their business model. Competitive athletes had rational self-interest in protecting their advantages. The system created the exclusion, not villainous individuals making deliberate choices to deceive. But the effect on frozen-out trainers was the same, regardless of intent. They followed every instruction, they bought every product, they trained with discipline and dedication for years. And they could never understand why their results didn't match what they saw on the covers. To understand what was achievable before the network existed, look at Steve Reeves. Reeves won Mr. America in 1947, Mr. World in 1948, and Mr. Universe in both 1948 and 1950. That night, after winning his second Mr. Universe title, he retired from competitive bodybuilding and became an actor. His competitive career ended 8 years before Dianabol even reached the American market. This timing matters. Reeves represents the control group, the baseline of what could be achieved through training, nutrition, and genetic gifts alone. He trained at Ed Yerrick's gym in Oakland, California. He even spent 7 weeks at York Barbell Club before the 1950 Mr. Universe competition. But this was before the network existed there. Ziegler's experiments with testosterone didn't begin until the mid-1950s. Dianabol wasn't available until 1958. Reeves' physique was extraordinary. He's regarded as one of the most influential bodybuilders of all time, credited with popularizing the sport on a global level. Arnold Schwarzenegger idolized him as a teenager, and every pound of muscle on his frame was built without pharmaceutical assistance, because the pharmaceutical assistance didn't exist yet. This isn't a verdict on anyone who came after. This is a timeline proof. Reeves shows what was historically achievable, and by extension, what frozen-out trainers in the 1960s could realistically aspire to. The men who followed the magazine programs and couldn't understand why they didn't look like the new generation of champions weren't failed by their genetics or their effort. They were measuring themselves against a standard that had quietly shifted without anyone telling them. The more complicated case studies are the athletes who clearly had access, but whose access pathways remain unclear. Bill Pearl opened his first gym in Sacramento, California in 1954, approximately 2,500 miles from York, Pennsylvania. He won his first Mr. America title in 1953. Historical accounts indicate he was among the first to show positive transformation with steroids. By 1971, he was at the peak of his remarkable career. The question isn't whether Pearl used steroids. The question is how someone in Sacramento gained network access. Through competition circuit contacts? Through training partners who had traveled east? Through visiting bodybuilders who passed through California? The research doesn't clearly trace the pathway. What the research does show is that Pearl became a secondary node in the network himself. He mentored bodybuilders including Chris Dickerson, who became the 1982 Mr. Olympia. The network reproduced itself through exactly this pattern. Recipients became distributors, and access spread outward through personal relationships. Reg Park presents a different puzzle. Based primarily in England and later South Africa, geographically distant from the Ziegler-York network, Park was a 3-time Mr. Universe winner, active during the 1950s and 1960s. He traveled to America. Those American trips may have been the connection point. How did the network reach England? Possibly through competition circuits as distribution vectors. Possibly through American bodybuilders visiting the UK. Possibly through Park's own US visits. The pathways for international access remain a research gap. What's clear is that by the time steroids became widespread in the late 1960s and 1970s, geographic barriers were eroding. But during the early 1960s, when the network was young and distribution was sporadic, location still determined access. By 1963, the network had expanded beyond weightlifting and bodybuilding entirely. San Diego Chargers head coach Sid Gilman administered Dianabol to his football team that year, with the drug placed in cereal bowls on the training table by strength coach Alvin Roy. Professional athletes in an entirely different sport now had access to the same substances that had transformed American weightlifting. The expansion followed predictable patterns. Roy had connections to the weightlifting world. Knowledge moved through personal relationships, from one coach to another, from one sport to another. What had started as a physician's careful experiment with Olympic lifters became a feature of American professional football within 4 years. West Coast gym culture gained access through similar channels. The golden era bodybuilding scene at Gold's Gym in Venice developed its own steroid environment, with actual doctors who supplied the golden era legends. The network that had begun with one physician in Maryland and one barbell club in Pennsylvania spread to Pasadena, to Venice Beach, to professional sports teams across the country. But spread takes time. Even as access expanded, isolated trainers stayed frozen out. The circulation remained sporadic. If you trained at the wrong gym, in the wrong city, with no connection to anyone in the network, you could spend years doing everything the magazines told you and never understand why your results didn't match. Ziegler watched what he had created grow beyond his control. Athletes took 20 times the dose he recommended. Where he had cautiously suggested 5 to 10 milligrams per day, some users consumed 50 milligrams or more. The careful medical oversight he had maintained, liver function tests every 4 months, controlled dosing, personal supervision, became impossible as distribution expanded beyond his reach. It was great at first, he would later recall. He had some weightlifters who said the Dianabol helped him a lot, but the spiral had begun. In a 1967 article, he condemned steroids categorically for athletes. In a 1969 Sports Illustrated piece, He complained that York lifters went crazy about steroids. He gave up experimentation entirely when he learned that some athletes who had taken those massive doses had developed liver conditions. 2 years before his death in 1983, Ziegler told lifting historian Terry Todd that he regretted his involvement with the drugs. He suffered from heart disease, which he partially ascribed to his own steroid experimentation. SIBA withdrew Dianabol from the U.S. market the same year Ziegler died. The FDA revoked approval entirely in 1985. The era of legal, prescription-based distribution ended, but by then, the knowledge had spread far beyond any pharmaceutical company's control, far beyond any physician's oversight. Here is what the frozen-out trainers need to understand. You weren't failed by your effort. You weren't failed by your genetics. You weren't failed by your dedication or your discipline or your willingness to suffer through another set, another rep, another month of following the program exactly as written. You were failed by geography. You were failed by the accident of where you happen to train, who you happen to know, which social networks you happen to be connected to. You were measuring yourself against a standard that had been chemically altered without anyone telling you the standard had changed. The men who did have access weren't villains. They were athletes pursuing competitive advantage through the tools available to them. The physicians who distributed weren't monsters. They were medical professionals making choices within a system that hadn't yet developed the rules or the understanding to govern what they were doing. The magazine publishers who omitted the key variable weren't running a conspiracy. They were businessmen following the economic logic of their industry. The system created the exclusion. Rational self-interest at every node, athletes protecting advantages, publishers protecting revenue, physicians protecting relationships, produced a structure that systematically locked out anyone who wasn't already inside. If you trained at a YMCA in the Midwest in the early 1960s, you never heard anything about steroids because there was no pathway for that information to reach you. You weren't naive. You weren't uninformed. You were geographically excluded from a distribution network that operated through personal connections, not through the magazines you read or the programs you followed. The physique you built through those years of training was real. The strength you developed was genuine. The discipline you cultivated stayed with you. What you achieved was what was historically achievable. The same thing Steve Reeves achieved. The same thing every champion before 1958 achieved. You weren't behind. You were competing against a different standard than the one you thought you were competing against. The supply chain that changed bodybuilding forever began with a pharmaceutical company in Switzerland, passed through a single physician in Maryland, and spread outward through personal relationships and geographic proximity. It was never published. It was never advertised. It moved from person to person, gym to gym, and the people outside that network had no way of knowing it existed. Decades later, the men who did everything right and still couldn't achieve what the magazine covers promised are owed an explanation. Not an accusation, not a prosecution, an explanation. The distribution network operated through personal connections, not publications. If you weren't connected, you weren't included. The villain was information asymmetry and geographic gatekeeping, not the athletes who used what was available to them. You can release the self-blame now. The years you spent wondering what you were doing wrong, whether your genetics were inferior, whether you simply lacked the will to push hard enough, those questions have an answer. The answer is that you were excluded by a system that was never going to include you, through no fault of your own. That's not a tragedy. That's clarity. And clarity, even decades late, has a way of setting things right. If you found value in understanding this history, subscribe for more stories like this.